Welcome to our video on sequence of tenses and indirect questions. This is designed to accompany Wheelock Chapter 30 in the 7th edition. So, we learned two new subjunctive tenses in this chapter. Remember that there are only 4 tenses of the subjunctive total. We learned the present in Chapter 28, the imperfect in Chapter 29, and now we're learning the perfect and the pluperfect. As review, the present tense of the imperfect in either active or passive, you picked the vowel for the verb based on the mnemonic device "we fear a liar," where those match up to the conjugations. For the imperfect tense, you took what looks to be the infinitive and then you add the endings. For active, that's mst, mustis, nt, and for passive, it's ris, tur, mur, mini, ntur. Now we're going to add the perfect and pluperfect. First, let's talk about the active voice. So the perfect active subjunctive you form by taking the perfect stem, which you get from the third principal part, and then adding erim, eris, erit, erimus, eritus, erint, as in the sample verb laudaverim in the first person singular. The pluperfect active subjunctive you form by taking the perfect stem, and then adding isem, isses, isset, issemus, issetus, issent, as in laudavisem, the first person singular. For the passive, we need to switch over to the fourth principal part. So we're going to take the perfect passive participle, and then put a space, and then put the word sim, si, sit, simus, situs, sint, which happens to be the present subjunctive of to be. So laudatae simus is an example of the first person plural. Remember that any perfect passive participle must agree with the noun it modifies in gender, number, and case. So here I have picked feminine plural nominative for a hypothetical feminine plural nominative subject. For the pluperfect passive subjunctive, we will likewise start with the perfect passive participle, and now we will add esem, esses, esset, essemus, essetus, essent, which is the present imperfect subjunctive of the word to be. And as a sample, I've picked laudata esset in the third person singular, and I have picked laudata to agree with a hypothetical feminine singular subject. Okay, so what do we want to do with these? Let's review a big topic called indirect discourse. That includes any kind of indirect discourse, like indirect statements or indirect questions. So we learned indirect statements several chapters back, as in the sample English sentence, Cicero said that Caesar did this. Caesar did this is a statement, and it is reported indirectly by introducing it with Cicero said that. In Latin, we take our main verb, said, that can be any mood, indicative, subjunctive, or imperative, and we add an accusative subject for the indirect statement and then the infinitive for the indirect statement. So, for example, Cicero dixit, and then accusative Caesarem, hoc fecissa, infinitive fecissa. Now we're going to learn indirect questions, which are constructed in an entirely different way in Latin. So, for example, in English, tell me why you did this. Why did you do this is the question, and we report it indirectly by introducing it with tell me. Tell me why you did this. You notice that in English, we also have our own way of doing indirect questions. It's not tell me why did you do this, although we can put it in that way as well. We can say tell me why you did this. So, for indirect questions, we can introduce it with the verb again in any mood, and then we add our question word, and then we put the verb of the indirect question into the subjunctive mood. So, for this sample sentence, mihi dic, tell me, cur hoc fecerit. Oops, I just changed it to tell me why he did this. Sorry, didn't intend that. Okay, so cur hoc fecerit is the indirect question. It's introduced by our main verb dic, where here I happen to have chosen an imperative. So, how do I pick the tense of the verb in the indirect question? So that is the last concept in this chapter, which is the sequence of tenses. So let's go back to the previous two chapters. For purpose and result clauses, which we learned in chapters 28 and 29, we noticed a pattern that if our main verb was in the present tense, then the verb in the subordinate clause was also in the present tense. If our main verb was in any of the past tenses, then our verb in the subordinate clause was in the perfect tense. So any of the past tenses means perfect, imperfect, or pluperfect. So it just so happens that in all purpose and result clauses, the action of the subordinate clause happens after the action of the main verb. That's the nature of a result. It happens after the thing that's causing the result. The nature of a purpose clause is it happens after the thing that you're doing in order to do the other thing. So in the sequence of tenses, if your main verb is in the present tense and you want to show something that happens after the verb of the main sentence, then you use the present subjunctive in the subordinate clause. If your main verb is in any of the past tenses, and you want to show that the action of the subordinate clause happens later, then you use the perfect tense. But when we get to indirect questions, we'll want to do some other things. So we will want to show sometimes that the action of the subordinate clause takes place at the same time as the action of the main verb. Sometimes we'll want to show that it happens later, and sometimes we'll want to show that it happens before. And we are now learning how to add in when the action of the subordinate happens before the action of the main verb. So for my sample English sentence, I wonder what you were doing, same time, what you will do, later time, what you did, prior time. So our sequence of tenses rules states that if our main verb is in the present tense or either future, the future or the future perfect, then if we want to show something that happens at either the same time or later, we can use the present subjunctive for either one of those. That means that in this instance, Latin is ambiguous as to whether the action of the subordinate verb is happening at the same time or after the action of the main verb. If we want to show something that happens before the action of the main verb, then we use the perfect tense. So these three tenses in the main verb together are called the primary sequence. If your main verb is in the present or either future, then you are in the primary sequence. And then you use either the present or the perfect tense in your subordinate clause. If your main verb is in any of the past tenses, then if you want to show that the action of the subordinate clause happens at the same time or later, you use the imperfect subjunctive. If you want to show that the action of the subordinate clause happens before the action of the main verb, then you use the pluperfect subjunctive. Together, all of the past tenses are called the historical sequence, or in some other textbooks, you'll see it called the secondary sequence. So, last but not least, if you look at the chart in Wheelock on page 248, you'll see a nice summary of the sequence of tenses. Remember that some other books are going to call the historical the secondary sequence. So, let's do some Latin examples. I know we are in present. We have a present tense main verb, so we're in the primary sequence. I know what you are doing. Action same time as the main verb. I know what you will do. Action later. I know what you did. Action prior. So our Latin verb scio, present tense. Remember that same time or later are both shown with the present subjunctive. So scio quid facias is both I know what you are doing and I know what you will do. There is ambiguity there in the Latin, but not in the English. I know what you did. Now we want to show action that happens before the main verb, so we use the perfect. Scio quid feceris. If we go down to secondary sequence or historical sequence, I knew, main verb is in the perfect tense, what you were doing, Notice here that English has its own sequence of tenses, right? I know what you are doing, but I knew what you were doing. I know what you will do versus I knew what you would do. I know what you did versus I knew what you had done. All right, now let's see how that translates into Latin. Scivi, perfect tense, I knew. If we want to show same time or later, we're going to use the imperfect subjunctive. So scivi quid faceres. And then if we want to show prior time, I knew what you had done, we want the pluperfect subjunctive. So scivi quid facises. That's all for now. See you next time.